Benjamin Netanyahu reveals 10 horrifying slave breeding secrets schools hid. 1. This wasn't just slavery, it was human farming. Netanyahu says schools hid the systematic breeding of enslaved black people. In a world where silence has too often been mistaken for peace, former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu broke the ritual quietude of diplomatic decorum. Known more for his steely posture on war and foreign affairs, Netanyahu unexpectedly turned his gaze inward, not toward his own nation, but toward the grotesque moral architecture of Western history. In doing so, he unearthed not merely forgotten injustices, but a vast and calculated system of human commodification. At the Global Human Rights and Historical Justice Summit in Geneva, his voice cut through the room like a blade through still water. This was not merely slavery, he declared. This was human farming. What followed was not the usual speech padded with generalities and regretful platitudes. Instead, Netanyahu dared to speak of a truth so meticulously buried that it no longer haunts even the dreams of modern education. Slavery, he argued, was not merely a system of domination and labor. It was a deliberate science of forced reproduction, a systemic conversion of black bodies into instruments of capital. With chilling clarity, he described a mechanism in which black women's wombs were no longer sacred vessels of life, but sites of industrial production. The enslaved were not just forced to work, they were engineered to multiply. Our children are taught that slavery was bad, Netanyahu began, but what they are not taught is that slavery in America was designed to be perpetual, not through chains alone, but through forced reproduction, sanctioned rape, and the deliberate engineering of human life. These words reverberated not only across the hall, but across the ethical consciousness of every listener. This was not the chaotic brutality of unregulated oppression. This was method. This was a system governed by profit margins and genetic preference, a kind of calculated depravity in which humanity was stripped away, not through violence alone, but through strategy. As he spoke, Netanyahu presented declassified records, ledgers, plantation logs, and private correspondences between slave owners and brokers, each document a coffin nail in the myth of benign neglect. These were not aberrations but artifacts of intention. One directive read, maximize womb output, breed for strength, cull for weakness. In another, all females of birthing age must be coupled with the strongest male at least twice a week. These were not metaphors. These were instructions, biological mandates inscribed in ink, carried out in flesh. He described how enslaved girls, some scarcely beyond childhood, were locked in breeding cabins, airless shacks designed not for shelter, but for violation. There, rape was not an atrocity, but a function, a scheduled task in the plantation's economy. Their youth was not measured in school years or dreams, but in offspring. These children were not seen as babies, but as yield, born into a ledger, priced before they were held. A plantation book from Alabama, dated 1847, detailed the calculus. Sally, 5 births, 4 living, next expected, January. Another page recorded newborns as one might livestock. Boy, strong back, 6 pounds. Girl, weak ankles, poor future use. This was not labor economics. It was eugenics in its rawest form. Capitalism unmasked as slow-motion genocide. But the system did not only exploit the body, it disintegrated the soul of community. Love was rendered obsolete. Families were methodically dismantled. Men were relocated as studs, not fathers. Their purpose was to inseminate, not to nurture. Women were forced to birth, not to mother. Infants were taken at birth, wrapped in coarse burlap and tagged for auction. Healthy male, 9 months old, strong hips. And their mothers, sent back to the fields, or worse, returned to the cabins, made to start again. This was not merely cruelty, it was the annihilation of kinship, the engineering of generational amnesia. This wasn't about work, Netanyahu continued. This was about replacing the need to buy slaves with the ability to grow them. By the mid-1800s, America's southern economy had nearly eliminated the need for transatlantic imports, not because of newfound morality, but because enslaved black women were now forced to produce the next labor force. Their reproduction was not a personal right, It was a plantation supply chain. He challenged the moral failing of Western pedagogy, the textbooks, the films, the solemn museum exhibits. They speak of slavery as toil, as cotton, as whips and shackles, but they almost never dare utter the deeper atrocity that Black people were bred like cattle. The American South's prosperity, its railways, its banking systems, its prestigious universities, was erected not only upon forced labor, but upon the mutilation of reproductive autonomy. To say slavery was evil is not enough, Netanyahu stated. We must say what kind of evil. And this was reproductive terrorism. This was sexual engineering. This was generational soul theft. His words ignited a moral firestorm. Across universities and media channels, the reaction was swift and polarizing. Some decried exaggeration, but others, particularly scholars, acknowledged the irrefutable authenticity of the records. Worse still, it was revealed that some of these very institutions, including Ivy League universities, had quietly stored these records in private collections for decades. They accepted donations from slave owners, built endowments upon blood-soaked wealth, and hid the receipts. Why have these documents been hidden? Netanyahu asked. Because the truth of what happened in America is not just painful, it is damning. And indeed it is. More than 150 years after the so-called end of slavery, the core question has evolved. What does justice look like when the crime was not simply enslavement, but the mass reproduction of bondage? What are reparations to a people whose very genes were manipulated by design? How do you compensate a lineage sculpted in chains, bred for submission, and robbed of the right to form family? Netanyahu was not offering guilt, he was demanding remembrance. The kind of remembrance that forces nations to confront the theology of their violence and the arithmetic of their cruelty. You cannot heal what you refuse to name, he said, and America must name this, that it was not just slavery, it was human farming. He closed his address with no dramatic flourish, no appeal to pity, only a stillness that weighed heavier than applause. The room fell quiet, not out of confusion, but out of recognition. Something sacred had been unearthed, and once spoken, the truth cannot be unspoken. 2. American textbooks were designed to lie. Netanyahu claims the U.S. education system erased the cruelest parts of slavery. Benjamin Netanyahu's thunderous address did not merely unveil the horrifying mechanics of human farming, it launched a ruthless indictment against the very systems designed to keep those horrors hidden. He turned his fire toward the foundation of modern American understanding, the education system. The American education system, Netanyahu declared with chilling clarity, is not ignorant, it is complicit. He accused U.S. schools not of failing to teach slavery, but of deliberately mutilating its memory, bleaching it, softening it, rendering it palatable. And in doing so, he charged, America preserved not just ignorance but innocence, the innocence of generations who never had to reckon with the true scale of the cruelty their nation was built upon. Netanyahu's words struck deep, not only because they were provocative, but because they rang with a terrible familiarity. How could a country so obsessed with liberty and justice, that floods its children with stories of George Washington, the Founding Fathers, and the Constitution, have buried one of the most monstrous systems of institutionalized abuse in human history beneath euphemisms, half-truths, and outright lies? The answer, Netanyahu said, lay in narrative control, the calculated shaping of memory to protect the powerful and perpetuate the myth of American moral superiority. Your textbooks, he said slowly, deliberately, were not written to educate you. They were written to comfort you, not to illuminate history, but to preserve a lie. The lie, Netanyahu explained, is not always one of commission, sometimes it's one of omission. He pointed to textbook after textbook, especially those circulated in the South during the 20th century, where slavery was either condensed into a few sanitized pages or presented in language that erased the blood, the chains, the screams, and the systemic violation of human dignity. Freedom is emphasized, he said bitterly, but the crimes that enslaved Black people endured, systematic rape, forced childbearing, family shredding, are treated like footnotes, or worse, erased entirely. The word rape rarely appears in school books. The term slave breeding is substituted with the eerily clinical phrase natural increase, as if the birth of children in bondage was some spontaneous and joyous miracle of population growth, rather than a cruel and cold-blooded enterprise of reproductive terrorism. It was not biology that drove this growth. It was the lash. It was forced pairings. It was institutional rape, conducted and condoned under law for economic gain. But American children are not told this. Instead, they are taught that enslaved people were passive laborers, victims of unfortunate circumstances rather than survivors of a violent, meticulously orchestrated system of human exploitation. To drive his point home, Netanyahu did something almost theatrical. He held up a century-old Southern textbook used well into the 1960s, reading aloud to the summit audience as if it were a bedtime story from hell. The book describes slavery as a paternal institution, with slaveholders cast as noble caretakers who looked after their laborers with concern and affection. It spoke of mutual loyalty between slaves and masters, of strong community ties, and even claimed that many enslaved persons were content with their lives. Netanyahu's voice shook as he read those words, not with emotion, but with disgust. Content, he echoed. Content as their children were ripped from their arms and sold like sacks of grain? As their wives were raped in front of them to destroy their masculinity and ensure docility? As their humanity was reduced to ink in a ledger? He held up an image of a plantation auction notice where a mother and two toddlers were being sold together with the tag, "Good breeder," "Reliable womb," "Toddlers optional." That was the truth, not the cartoonish fiction of singing slaves and benevolent masters. But the deception wasn't limited to public school textbooks. Netanyahu turned his sights on American academic institutions, colleges, universities, and historical societies, accusing them of enshrining a culture of selective access and scholarly suppression. What of the journals, he demanded? The plantation records? The overseer logs? Where are they? He accused elite universities of possessing troves of primary documents that explicitly detail the reproductive strategies of slaveholders, but instead of making these records widely accessible, they've been locked in obscure archives, protected by bureaucratic barriers, redacted citations, or buried in restricted access collections. He cited testimonies from researchers, particularly Black scholars, who were denied access to these documents or subtly discouraged from publishing work that contradicted the sanitized American mythos. One Black historian reportedly had her dissertation on slave breeding rejected for being too emotional, while another was told by her university that focusing on rape and slavery distracted from the broader economic narrative. It is not just ignorance, Netanyahu repeated. It is a whitewashing of generational trauma. It is a lie told in every classroom that omits the screams of mothers whose babies were taken, that silences the moans of girls raped to produce another worker. Netanyahu called this erasure an act of violence, not physical, but epistemic. To erase a people's pain is to erase their power, he said. To distort their suffering is to desecrate their memory. And to teach children lies about their nation's past is to ensure the sins of that past will be repeated, reimagined, and reborn. This, he argued, is why America has never healed from its racial wounds, because the country refuses to look honestly at the knife in its hand. It refuses to say, we did this. We engineered wombs to build wealth. We incentivized rape. We destroyed families. We made human beings into livestock. And then we wrote history books that taught our children to smile about it. He spoke not only to the historical lie, but to the consequences of those lies today. Because when textbooks erase the horror of slavery, they also erase the justification for reparations. When schools teach that slavery was simply long ago, or that it was just unpaid labor, they rob descendants of the enslaved of their rightful place as survivors of genocide and position them instead as the beneficiaries of white mercy. Do you not see, Netanyahu asked, that the lie is not only about the past, but also about the present? If you believe the sin was small, then you will believe the debt is small. If you minimize the crime, you deny the need for justice. Perhaps the most damning line of his speech came near the end. The most dangerous lie, he said, is not the denial of history. It's the selective editing of it. He described a country where students graduate high school knowing about Betsy Ross's flag, but not about the forced breeding farms in Virginia. They can recite the Gettysburg Address, but cannot tell you what a stud slave was. They celebrate July 4th without realizing that, for millions of people, that date marked not freedom, but the height of generational bondage. Netanyahu urged the global community to reject this curated ignorance. He called for a reformation of historical curriculum in the United States, one that doesn't flinch in the face of brutality, but confronts it with moral clarity and intellectual courage. Truth must be taught, he said, not only to honor the dead, but to free the living. In that moment, the auditorium was silent, not out of confusion, but conviction, because Netanyahu had done something powerful. He had called out the lie, and in doing so, he exposed the greatest weapon of white supremacy in modern America. Not the whip, not the chain, not even the bullet, but the textbook. The clean, glossy, state-approved textbook that turns agony into anecdote and trauma into trivia. Until that book is rewritten, with the full truth, the blood-soaked truth, the lie will live on, and so will the legacy of silence. 3. Breeding for profit, not humanity. Netanyahu exposes the slave auction records that show children were priced like cattle, with a voice trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of undeniable truth. Benjamin Netanyahu laid bare a portion of history so savage, so clinically dehumanizing, that even the most hardened among the audience at the Global Human Rights Summit could not look away. Gone were the rhetorical flourishes, the historical analyses, the political context. What Netanyahu presented next was raw, brutal evidence, undeniable and unedited. Holding what he grimly referred to as America's Holocaust ledger, he unveiled a sprawling archive of slave auction records once concealed in private collections, hidden behind the pristine facades of museums, libraries, and southern estates. But now, brought into the light, these documents screamed with the agony of millions. They were not just papers. They were receipts of horror. Each page, each line, each inked name was a declaration of evil systematized. Black children, some not even old enough to speak in full sentences, were cataloged and priced not as people, not even as laborers, but as livestock, measured, evaluated, and sold according to cold, profit-driven criteria. Age, height, weight, bone structure, teeth quality, and most disturbingly, reproductive potential. These were the categories by which value was assigned, not by heart, not by mind, but by womb and muscle. Teenage girls were labeled not as daughters or future women, but as prime breeding age. The words leapt off the yellowed pages like bile from a sick stomach. A 15-year-old girl described as tall hips, good birthing frame, docile temperament. Boys of the same age were evaluated for their muscle tone, their projected work endurance, and sometimes, horrifyingly, for their future stud capacity. It was a slave market, yes, but it was also a eugenics lab, centuries before such language would be used to condemn the Nazis. Netanyahu, with a tone that seethed beneath the surface of his diplomacy, called out the grotesque irony of it all. The very eugenic ideologies America would later denounce in Nazi Germany were born, perfected, and exported from its own southern plantations. While American soldiers stormed European death camps in 1945, waving the banners of freedom and human rights, their own soil still bore the stains of auction blocks and blood-soaked breeding pens. Netanyahu did not need to embellish. The records spoke for themselves. Negress, age 23, has borne 6 strong children, fertility high, excellent investment. Another, boy, age 12, back muscles defined, good candidate for long field work, father unknown. These were not isolated entries. They were columns, entire spreadsheets where human life was reduced to economic calculus. Mothers were routinely separated from their children, not as a cruel byproduct, but as deliberate economic strategy. One boy was sold to a plantation in Georgia, his mother to a landowner in Mississippi, and his baby sister, only 2 years old, to a family in Virginia. The logic was simple and sickening. Families sold separately brought higher total revenue than sold together. Unity was a liability, division was profit. Netanyahu cited one record that baldly stated, "Bundle sale loses value, break apart for higher margin." These people were being disassembled, like furniture. And if that wasn't enough, Netanyahu highlighted the language used in these documents, language that was disturbingly similar, often identical, to that used in livestock auctions of the time. Side by side, he showed two separate records, one listing the sale of horses and another listing enslaved black people. The structure of the entries was the same. The descriptors, sound limbs, good breeder, calm disposition, were eerily interchangeable. This wasn't coincidental, Netanyahu said. This was intentional. The American South, and much of the North that financially backed it, treated black human beings not as unfortunate laborers, but as capital stock. This wasn't emotional abuse. This was industrial abuse. There were no metaphors here. A black mother's womb was literally a line item on a business ledger. A baby's crying was not heard as a sound of life, but as the echo of economic opportunity. But perhaps the most appalling revelation wasn't in the records themselves. It was in how public they were. These auctions weren't conducted in back alleys or whispered between secret societies. They were open, sanctioned, often celebrated affairs. Towns would shut down for the day, crowds would gather, and newspapers would run advertisements weeks in advance. Negro sale, Thursday at noon. Breeders and workers available. Children played near the platforms as if attending a fair. Priests blessed the proceedings, bankers financed the purchases, and politicians turned their eyes away because they were often the buyers. This was not a fringe practice, Netanyahu said flatly. This was the American economy. This was the backbone of cotton, of sugar, of rice, of Wall Street. This was America's foundation. Even northern industrialists who pretended moral outrage in public were secretly investing in these human auctions, using the proceeds to build railroads, shipyards, and Ivy League institutions. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were structural, systemic, sustained. They were the gears of capitalism turning in time with the heartbeat of human suffering. Netanyahu then turned to the women. He said their pain had been buried deepest of all, not just beneath the soil of plantations, but beneath the silence of history. These women were judged not by character, not by intellect, not by spirit, but by womb performance. Auction logs proudly declared, has borne 8 children by age 25, as if listing the production yield of a prize dairy cow. Women were often resold multiple times, each time evaluated for their declining fertility. One record read, age 28, only 2 children. Fertility uncertain. Discount applied. Even more horrifying were the entries that categorized young girls, some only 10 or 11 years old, as soon to be of value, marked and monitored as future breeders. This was not a society that simply permitted rape. It monetized it, and it taught its children that such violence was not evil, but enterprise. This is not ancient history, Netanyahu emphasized. This is documented, archived, and in some cases, still being held under lock and key by American institutions that refuse to open their vaults. He challenged universities and museums across the U.S. to stop protecting the legacies of slave-owning families and start releasing the full truth. What good is a record if it stays buried? What justice can rise from silence? The answer, he said, lies in full exposure, in bringing the ledger out from behind glass, in reading every name, in naming every child sold, every womb abused, every body tagged and priced and sold for the sin of being born black in a land that saw profit in pigmentation. Netanyahu's words close with a chilling echo. What America did to black people through these auctions was not just slavery, it was a calculated program of genetic commodification. This was not just the theft of labor, it was the theft of humanity, generation after generation, womb after womb, child after child. And as the screen behind him displayed pages of these horrific records, the audience did not clap. They could not, because applause is for performances. And what Netanyahu delivered was not a performance, It was a funeral for forgotten names. It was an indictment of an empire. It was the sound of truth, shattering silence. 4. Reparations mean nothing without truth. Netanyahu says slave breeding must be acknowledged for healing to begin. As Benjamin Netanyahu's speech reached its searing crescendo, the former Israeli prime minister shed the armor of politics and exposed the raw nerves of human suffering buried deep beneath the American mythos. He no longer spoke as a diplomat or even a historian. He spoke as a witness to truth, summoning the world not to numbers, not to charts, but to conscience. All this talk of reparations, he said, his voice low but cutting, and yet no one will even say the words. Forced breeding, institutional rape, genocidal family destruction. Until we name the crimes, we cannot heal. It was not just a statement, it was an indictment, a demand that shook the foundations of American discourse on justice and reparation. Netanyahu insisted that the conversation around reparations has been sterilized, hijacked by politicians who speak of checks and compensation, but refuse to address the spiritual and historical mutilation at the system's core. How can a nation claim to offer justice, he asked, when it hasn't even told the truth? How can it speak of restoration when the crimes that most deeply scarred the soul of Black America are still unspoken, undocumented in school books, and excised from national memory? For Netanyahu, reparations are meaningless without truth because the damage inflicted was not just material, it was existential. Slave breeding, he said, was not a side effect of slavery. It was one of its most intimate and soul-shattering weapons. It wasn't just about stolen labor. It was about stolen identity, stolen motherhood, stolen bloodlines. He emphasized that this trauma did not die in the 19th century. It lives on, in fractured family structures, in cultural dislocation, in the inherited psychological wounds etched into the DNA of millions of descendants. The legacy of slave breeding is not a metaphor, he said. It is a measurable wound, a wound that bleeds through generations. Psychologists have long studied the effects of generational trauma, manifesting in chronic anxiety, abandonment issues, fractured identity, mistrust of authority. But Netanyahu argued that these symptoms are not abstract afflictions. They are the direct descendants of deliberate, institutionalized practices designed to obliterate the human dignity of an entire race. The forced separation of mother and child, the calculated rape of girls for population control, the eugenic stripping of families to maximize profit. These were not unfortunate consequences. They were policy, and worse still, they were denied, erased, and hidden behind sanitized history and national pride. When a child is taken from its mother, Netanyahu said softly, something breaks. When that happens for generations, a nation breaks, a people break. His words hung in the air like a funeral bell, tolling not just for the past, but for the present condition of Black America. Netanyahu described a psychological rupture, not born from weakness, but from generations of engineered abandonment, where fathers were treated as studs, mothers as wombs, and children as future assets or liabilities. And when that pain was never validated, never grieved, never publicly acknowledged by the very nation that inflicted it, it festered into generational silence. And unless that breaking is acknowledged, Netanyahu said, there can be no restoration. Reparations, in his view, must begin not with a checkbook, but with confession, with truth-telling so bold, so painful, and so honest that it shatters the illusions generations have been raised to believe. He turned his call to action directly at the gatekeepers of knowledge, universities, historians, teachers, textbook publishers. You've spent over a century protecting American comfort, he said, but now it is time to protect American conscience. He challenged them to rewrite the textbooks, not just to mention slavery, but to expose it. Not just to speak of cotton and shackles, but to teach about how wombs were turned into factories of profit. How teenage girls were assigned monetary value not by their intellect or hopes or dreams, but by how many children they could produce. How entire families were manufactured and dismantled like assembly lines for white wealth. Stop teaching children that America made a mistake, he warned. Teach them that America built an empire through intentional, mechanized cruelty, through blood, through rape, through reproductive genocide. And to those who feared that such truths were too harsh for young minds, Netanyahu was unapologetic. The children who lived it were not too young to endure it, so the children of today are not too young to learn it. This, he emphasized, is the only path to meaningful reparations, reparations of memory, of dignity, of identity. Without a national reckoning, without a public mourning, without a curriculum soaked in the painful honesty of history, financial reparations become hollow gestures. Reparations without truth, he said, are like bandages on a wound you refuse to admit exists. They might hide the bleeding, but they do not stop it. And the bleeding continues in the form of economic disparity, institutional mistrust, disproportionate incarceration, and the subtle yet relentless demonization of Black identity. These are not new injustices, Netanyahu said. They are modern manifestations of an old design. Until the blueprint of that design, slave breeding, forced reproduction, family disintegration, is laid bare before the world, America will continue to treat the symptoms of racial inequality without ever addressing the cause. Netanyahu's final words were not grandiose. They were surgical, precision-guided, a final incision into the national delusion. If America cannot face the truth about what it did to Black bodies, he said, if it cannot name the crimes, mourn the victims, and dismantle the lies, then it is doomed to repeat them in new forms. And those forms, he warned, may wear different faces: mass incarceration, systemic poverty, educational exclusion, but they are cut from the same cloth, the same silence, the same refusal to name the original sin. He did not call for guilt. He called for grief, for courage, for a kind of moral honesty that pierces through patriotic mythology and lays the bones of the past bare before the eyes of the living. Only then, Netanyahu said, can healing begin, not just for Black America, but for the soul of a nation that has spent centuries writing a script where cruelty was downplayed and survival was ignored. As his voice faded, the room stood still. Not in applause, but in reckoning. Because in that moment, Netanyahu had not just asked America to write a check, he had asked it to write a eulogy, and then to write a new chapter. One not built on lies, but on truth. Not built on comfort, but on courage. Not built on forgetting, but finally, at long last, on remembering.